Hello and welcome to Hawkeye Nation. This is Hawkcast, your Iowa football, basketball, and recruiting podcast brought to you by Go Iowa Awesome and Rivals.com. I'm your recruiting analyst and host, Eliot Clough at Eliot Clough on Twitter. Before we get started today, make sure that you subscribe wherever you're listening, including on YouTube as we are over there. Drop that like button, hit that like button rather. And then if you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc., hit subscribe, leave that rate and review. It helps us out a lot. This week, we're joined by Jellison of the BoilerUpload, and I was looking at him momentarily to make sure I spelled that, or I pronounced that right. Wow, off to a rough start here on Hawkcast on this preview episode. Also part of the Rivals Network, BoilerUpload. Dub, you got a new coach, new quarterback, whole lot of new in West Lafayette this year. Tell me, has the team lived up to expectations? What were your expectations going into the season?
Yeah, I think anyone that was realistic about 2023 for Purdue realized that this wasn't going to be that Big Ten championship game type year for them again. You lose your head coach, you lose your starting quarterback, star wide receiver, tight end. You lose a bunch of guys over there on defense as starters. And Ryan Walters was a little behind the eight ball just in terms of what he had to work with. Like you mentioned, he did bring in Hudson Card at quarterback, but there's still so many moving parts, specifically on defense with a brand new scheme that's difficult to play. You have to have your guys in there, and Purdue hasn't really had their guys in there. But my expectations for the year were if Purdue can make a bowl game, it would be successful. I didn't anticipate them going 4-8, 3-9. I know a lot of people did, which I was kind of surprised by. I know that someone picked them to finish last in the Big Ten West, which had me scratching my head. Yeah, yeah, had me scratching my head a little bit. But I didn't think that the defense would look this poor as it has through 5 games. But like I mentioned, it's kind of a result of what you have in terms of personnel. So it's been a very up and down start for Purdue this year, but I think they're very happy with where they're at, getting to 2-3 with a very hard schedule as well.
Well, you mentioned Ryan Walters coming in after that Big Ten championship appearance last year for Jeff Brohm and company. I'm going to go off the beaten path for a second here before we really get into the game. Do you think Louisville is a better job than Purdue for Jeff
Not right
Brohm?
now. Not with everything that's going on with the Big Ten and all the expansion and the money that's flowing into the conference, but it's home for him. Like there's some Purdue fans that get all up in our arms and want to see Louisville do bad. And it's like, I mean, this guy did a lot for this program, pulled him out of the depths of hell, to be quite honest with you. I mean, I'm sure you remember seeing some of those Purdue teams when they played Iowa. It was rough. And it was rough playing against everybody, you know. So he came in here and I don't necessarily want to say saved the program, but came in there and brought them back to relevancy, got them to a Big Ten championship game, something they hadn't done in the program history, got them back-to-back 8-win years, something that hadn't been done since the early 2000s. So you can't really fault the guy for going home after he had done his job up here in West Lafayette. And I think a big part of it was his dad. I know his dad was really pushing him to take it back in 2018, I believe it was. And he decided not to because he had made some promises to some guys on the roster that he'd be there throughout their time at Purdue. So once Satterfield left, I mean, we were there doing the press conference for the Citrus Bowl after they had announced the game, and you could just tell. I mean, someone brought it up. They're like, "Hey, Louisville's got an opening," and he's like, "Oh, I don't know anything about that." Couple days later, he's having his introductory press conference. So, but no, to answer your question, I know it's kind of long winded, but no, I don't think Louisville's a better job, but it's home for him. So,
Gotcha. With Ryan Walters coming in, he brought in to instill that defense, one of the best in the Big Ten with Illinois, arguably in the country. You hit it. I was actually just going to say it is you really have to bring in your own recruits. You have to bring in your own guys. 17 sacks. I mean, you can't be upset with that, right? But you said it hasn't lived up quite to what you were hoping for.
Yeah, those outside linebackers, man, you got that 5-man front, bringing 5 guys basically every single snap. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but it's gotta be in the 90 percentile of them bringing all 5 of those guys. So, Nick Scorton, who's kind of been a breakout guy for Purdue, the sophomore, he played a little bit as a true freshman last year, but mostly in a reserve role. He's done very well. And then Kydron Jenkins, he's the other outside linebacker. He's been phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. And his issue was never how good he was, it was staying healthy and being consistent, and that's exactly what he's done. So that pass rush has been great. And I don't know if you had a chance to see Purdue's game against Illinois, but Brian Walters went back to calling the plays, and he started dialing up some pressures. It resulted in a strip sack that turned into a touchdown from a cornerback blitzing. Got a couple other sacks from defensive backs rushing. So I think Purdue's really focusing on that pass rush because they have to, because those guys on the back end haven't been able to prove that they've been able to hold up as much.
Now, Iowa fans have kind of been disappointed to this point in the season with the pass rush in Iowa City, and for good reason. I mean, that was expected to be one of the deeper parts of the team this season. Obviously, losing Noah Shannon doesn't help that, but only 3 sacks to this point, and they're looking at 17. Like, oh my lord, must be living in the backfield in West Lafayette.
Like you, we get so wrapped up from week to week looking at these opponents, so it's hard to like keep track on everybody. But like when I saw that Iowa only had 3 sacks, I was shocked. That's absolutely insane out of a Kirk Ferentz team.
Yeah, and you'd think a lot of them would be coverage sacks too, just because
Yeah.
of. I mean, you got Cooper DeJean back there, right? Xavier Wampa, 5-star, Quinn Schulte, super experienced. Jamari Harris coming back. Jamari Harris has been kind of getting into the flow of things. Got his first pick in 2 years last week after the injury from last year, but that number is also it's because of the way other teams have approached playing Iowa to this point. Get the ball out quick,
Yeah.
especially against Western Michigan, especially against Utah State, especially against Iowa State, where those offenses aren't as good. It's just bam, ball out. Like you touch the ball and it's to a receiver, it's to a tight end, it's to a running back. So it's largely a byproduct of that, but also just lack of production there. So you could put that point to a few things. You could point to fitness. You could point to just opposing. I would mostly put it on the scheme of these other teams that they're facing because they know what they're facing against. I mean, Noah Shannon is obviously not ideal, but 4-star Aaron Graves is in there as well, and YA Black, who's a physical freak. But when we revert more so back to the Purdue defense here, I have to think based on the fact that Cade McNamara is down, 1, and 2, the offensive line at Iowa has not been very good this year. I have to imagine that 5-man front is just licking their chops going into this weekend.
Yeah, and we talked to Kevin Kane earlier today, and he was steadfast on like, hey, these guys are going to come out and run the ball with the backup quarterback. Obviously, even with McNamara in there, they hadn't really moved the ball through the air all that well. So I think that's really Purdue's focus, and it's an area that they've really struggled with, especially containing the quarterback, which I don't know how much they'll have to do that with Deacon Hill back there. I mean, he'll be tough to bring down at 260, which is insane when I saw that. But I don't think he's the same runner as like a Garrett Schrader or Luke All that have really burned Purdue over these last 3 or 4 games. So yeah, I mean, I would anticipate them kind of selling out and trying to stop that run. And Ryan Walters from day one during his introductory press conference, he said, we want to make the opposing quarterbacks beat us. We're playing against the quarterbacks, and that's exactly what they're going to do on Saturday.
Well, you mentioned the run. It's starting to look like Caleb Johnson's going to be back this week for Iowa. He's been practicing. We're probably going to learn more about that tonight on when Kirk's available with Gary Dolphin on their weeknight shows. But he was shown in a picture on Instagram that they shared today that he was practicing. Usually that's an indicator that they're going to play on the weekend. So expecting Caleb Johnson to be back, which is going to be a huge weight off this backfield. two true freshmen getting a bunch of snaps. Well, mostly Kamari Moulton getting a lot of snaps. Obviously, Le'Shawn Williams really looking to be the bell cow. They could not establish the run to save their damn lives last week against Michigan State. One thing that is a positive for Deacon Hill as opposed to Cade McNamara is Cade was dealing with that right leg issue, that thigh. So Deacon's a little bit more mobile, and he's going to be tough to bring down because he's 260 pounds. So I'm sure you've heard a lot about his arm as well. I don't know if you saw my tweet that's gone like semi-viral with the Iowa fan base. The furthest he's ever thrown the ball, he said, is 73 or 74 yards. Whether or not he can put it where it needs to be is another thing at this point in his career. And the Iowa wide receivers had 6 drops last week, 5 of them with Deacon Hill. So that is definitely something to take note of. But you mentioned the guys on the back end having struggles to this point in the season. Is that youth? Is that getting used to the system? What's going on there?
I think it's just simply what's asked of them. I mean, they're all playing, with the exception of Dylan Thieneman, who's kind of that ball hawking safety, the center fielder. He's lining up. I think people will be, if you watch Illinois last year, you'll kind of be accustomed to it, I guess, a little bit. But he lines up 15, 20 yards off the line of scrimmage. I mean, he's way back there. So his job is just to clean everything up, play zone. But outside of him, all defensive backs are playing straight up man, 90-some% of the time. So if they lose that, we've seen it a lot this year. When they lose those one-on-one battles, you're going to have guys wide open. So Purdue's been susceptible to giving up the big plays. Isaiah Williams burned them a little bit. Going back to week 1, Fresno State's wide receiver Eric Brooks had a huge game. Jalen Lane had a really good game for Virginia Tech too. So it's all those guys that, I mean, you have to win those one-on-one battles, and if you don't, Purdue's kind of behind the 8 ball there. And they brought in a couple of transfers, Markevious Brown from Ole Miss and then Marquise Wilson from Penn State. And they've held up fairly well, but like I mentioned, they've both been susceptible to giving up big plays. And then Cam Allen, he has 2 picks, and he's played all 5. He's using his COVID year this year. He's played all 5 years. Going back to when he was a true freshman, he's been really struggling in pass coverage. So that's a guy he could match up with like Eric All or one of the Iowa tight ends, and that could be an area that they can exploit on Saturday.
Now, I'm sure, well, like you and everybody else in the country and the Big Ten, I'm sure you've heard plenty about the Iowa offense, especially the passing game to this point. I did this last week with Justin Rose when we were previewing the Michigan State game. So I'm going to ask you, do you know how many catches Iowa's wide receivers have to this point in the season?
Oh, I literally was just looking at this. I'm going to go with 18.
20.
That was close.
That was very close. That was nice.
I know for a fact that none of them have reached, I think it's over 80 yards.
I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know that off the top of my head, but
Eric All was the only one that was over 100 besides Leachy, but Leachy's out. So
right. Lachey, by the way, Luke Lachey.
Okay.
But it doesn't matter because he's hurt. So going to this one is not really a big deal for you. But when you look at that, does that you mentioned the big plays? Talked about Eric All, who's a really, really good receiving tight end. I mean, you could split him out and play wide receiver, and he, in fact, kind of does that when they make him go 5 wide. But that lack of receptions by the receivers, there has been, if I'm remembering correctly, like one big play, and it was the first big play. It was the first play of the season, or second play of the season, first passing play of the season, Cade McNamara to Seth Anderson against Utah State. So I guess there were a few big passes last week, or one big pass. I think it was like 30 or 40 yards from Hill to All. But that lack of production by the wide receivers, is that something you point to as a guy who covers the Boilermakers and say, well, that's good for Purdue, because if they're not producing, that's going to take a little bit of the weight off the back end?
Yeah, most definitely. And I think this is a game that Purdue, like you mentioned a little bit earlier, they're licking their chops at, because they know that Iowa hasn't shown to be able to beat teams over the top, even a little bit. So they'll be able to really hone in on that pass rush. And As long as those guys on the outside and the back end can keep up just even a little bit, they should be able to get to the quarterback and make Deacon Hill have a really tough day. But like you mentioned, yeah, I mean, it's for a defense, it's starting to get its confidence. I think this is a perfect matchup for them.
Moving to the offensive side of the ball for Purdue, we know they like to air it out a lot last season under Jeff Brohm with Aiden O'Connell, now the starting quarterback for the Raiders, obviously. Is that kind of their same MO with Hudson Card this year? I know I looked at the receivers and one of their receivers has 24 catches as opposed to Iowa's 20. So that like blows my mind as a guy who covers Iowa football. Are they airing it out quite a bit with Hudson Card under center?
Yeah, so it's actually pretty contrary. They've been very balanced. So it's not like that Mike Leach air raid offense that Graham Harrell played in college. He's been very upfront about it. He's like, we're going to get our playmakers the ball no matter where they're at. And they really leaned on Tyrone Tracy, who I know obviously I was very familiar with. Moved to running back after being a receiver for 5 years in college. And um, it makes you wonder what he could have been if he was a running back the entire time, because he's just been a breath of fresh air into that room. They really leaned on him, and then to a lesser extent, Devin Maccabee, which is very surprising. But Maccabee's dealt with fumble issues, so I think he's up to 5 or 6 now on the year, after just having 2 last year. So that kind of Cinderella story is taking a bit of a halt, and he got passed up for that starting running back job, but they're still going to feature both guys. I think Tracy had 21 carries and Maccabee had 14 in the win over Illinois. So, I mean, Purdue's still going to run the ball. I think they'll still lean on it because I know that Iowa has been somewhat susceptible to giving up, not big plays in the run game, but allowing a lot of rushing yards a little bit. So I think Purdue's really going to lean on that. But to go back to your actual question, I keep going off on these tangents. I'm sorry. But it hasn't been the type of offense that I think everyone expected in West Lafayette, and the one that has really been in West Lafayette since Joe Tiller came here in 1997.
So before the season started, we did a preview pod of just the schedule, and I referenced Hudson Card and this potentially being a trap game if Iowa beat Penn State. Obviously, that didn't happen. So, and Michigan State being a trap game too, for that matter. Purdue kind of can get their number from year to year, but and I referenced Hudson Card, and I believe he was a 4-star on Rivals coming out of high school. Yeah, and obviously didn't get the starting job at Texas, but when you're matching up against Quinn Ewers, that's going to be difficult. So he moves to playing at Purdue. A similar question to what I asked at the top of the pod. Has he been as good as some folks expected him to be? Has he produced to the degree that I don't know, expectations were there, or has he been a surprise, a disappointment? Where are you at with Card? Because I know he's 5 touchdowns, just 3 interception. Like that surprised me. Just 5 touchdowns at this point.
Yeah, that's been a result of Purdue's just been terrible in the red zone, and they haven't been able to cap off drive for the most part, besides the Illinois game. A lot of that's can be attributed to turnovers, and they've been very porous in 3rd and 1 and 4th and 1 in short yardage scenarios. So I think that kind of relates to the touchdown passes. But I mean, you look at his numbers, I think he's top, he's a second in the Big Ten in passing yards. So he's been productive. He had a 2-game stretch where he had 5 turnovers, I believe it was, against Syracuse and Wisconsin, which kind of threw a wrench in things. But it hasn't, like I mentioned, it hasn't been that air raid where they're going to drop it back. They're going to drop back and throw it 40, 45, 50 times. So he's done the best that he can under the circumstances. The way that they talked about him leading up to the season, you would have thought it was the second coming of Drew Brees in West Lafayette. It hasn't quite been that, but I think that Graham Harrell and Ryan Walters are very happy with where Hudson Card is and just his understanding of the offense, and things like that. And they've been able to move the ball well. It's just about punching it in for them. So, yeah, I mean, Hudson Card hasn't quite lived up to my expectations, just because literally every time we were at practice, it felt like people were just singing the praises of Hudson Card. And while he's done some really good things, he's left a little bit to be desired.
Questions when it comes to Card.
Mm-hmm.
First, when asked about opposing players, Iowa does a really good job of hyping them up where there might not be something to substantiate there. They did say that Card is a little more mobile. Is he a guy that can pull it down and run pretty frequently, or does he just have that capability, doesn't do it? What does that look like? What's his mobility like?
He most definitely has the capability. He ran for 50 some yards against Wisconsin. That kind of out of necessity. He was running for his life in that game. But I think he's been a little bit hesitant to run with his legs. He didn't do it a whole lot the first few games of the year. And I think Coach Walters and Graham Harrell said something to him about it. They referenced it during one of the availabilities. And he started to pick it up a little bit. He's not going to be a guy that's like Caleb Williams or going back to like Kyler Murray or someone like that who's going to rip off 70, 80-yard runs, but he can get you 20, 25-yard chunk plays with his legs because he's that athletic, and he also does a really good job of moving around in the pocket, being elusive with his legs as well.
You mentioned those short yardage situations, trying to finish off drives. Is it the offensive line, just to put it simply?
Yes.
Okay.
I will say that over the last couple of games that they've been a lot better. They got Gus Hartwig back, who's been a 2-3 year starter for them down at center. He's done wonders for that offensive line, man. It's been remarkable, honestly, just to see him come in there. And it feels like that group's really rallied around him because he had a brutal knee injury against Northwestern in November last year. Worked all summer, all spring, all fall to get back, and finally made his debut against Wisconsin a couple weeks ago. And Coach Walters credited him, and he said, like, hey, this offensive line is playing leaps and bounds better, and I think it's because of Gus Hartwig. So Purdue's averaged like 100, just over 190 yards on the ground with Hartwig back in the lineup. So he's doing something right, and they did do a little bit better in those 3rd and 1, 4th and 1s. I think Graham Harrell's also been a little more creative with his play calling, trying to maybe spread them out a little bit more, because during the first few games, they were just running it right up the gut and getting stuffed every time. And going back to your question about Hudson Card's mobility, him and the read option haven't quite gelled like I thought they would. It's kind of been clunky there. He's very hesitant to decide when he's going to pass it off and when he's going to take it and tuck it and run on his own. And that was a big issue in those short yardage situations too.
Back to Tyrone Tracy. Mm-hmm. Playing running back right now, obviously spent those first 5 years at receiver. First question is this like the Charlie Jones situation where he's just chilling at Iowa doing nothing and then shows up as super productive, basically gets everything he wants out of being at a different school and continuing to make Brian Ferentz look bad?
A little bit. Jeff Brohm he admitted this. He said that he didn't feel like he was used properly last year. He's still at wide receiver, kind of that gadget guy. He did have a bigger role in the backfield, and then Lamar Connard, who was at Miami of Ohio, came in, and he's known Tracy for a long time. Coached both of his brothers at Miami, and things have just clicked back there for him. He's been phenomenal. He's got a rushing touchdown each of the first 5 games of the year. Had a kickoff return for a touchdown in the first game. He's just been electric with the ball in his hands, and it hasn't looked the prettiest. He's not going to make a bunch of guys miss and run for 60, 70 yards on a single play, but most of Purdue's chunk plays and explosive plays out of the backfield have come with him with the ball in his hands. He's been very good in space, and he's a north and south runner, but he can also make guys miss, and he's really excelling in this air raid offense that's featuring the ground game.
Can't help but think I can't help but think of Aladdin with both of these guys. A whole new world. It's just like, whoa, I can touch the ball. You know what I'm saying?
It's wild. It's not to the level of Charlie Jones last year, but
sure.
I mean, I know Iowa's had their issues with Brian Ferentz. Well, we could do a 2-hour podcast just talking about him, which I'm sure you
Oh
guys have
yeah.
done. You guys have done
Yeah.
for the last 5 months.
If somebody told me I'd be singing for you, Dub, I would have been very surprised. Anyway, so has he just kind of taken that transition from wide receiver to running back just in stride? And he really embracing it, going full bore for running back. Do you see him maybe making it in the league at this point with what he's done at the running back position?
I've been starting to think that I don't think he's a guy that's gonna climb up the draft boards and be in like the second, third round or anything, but I think he could be an undrafted free agent and possibly make a team if he's doing this type of stuff. But yeah, I mean, a lot of people thought that he should have been a running back all along. It kind of reminds me of, I don't know if you remember Raheem Mostert while he was at Purdue, but yeah, they stuck him over at that whole era had a bunch of issues, but this is just a small one. They stuck Raheem Mostert over at receiver, and he did really well in the kick return game. Finally put him at running back his senior year. Had a decent year. It's hard to have a good year with just all the issues that era had. Um, and now you see him in the NFL. He's going on his 11th year, I think. It's still kicking at running back. So I think that could be Tyrone Tracy. It draws a lot of similarities, although I do think that Mostert was more talented.
Oh, I have seen I saw a spread as we're going into this weekend, as we're going into this game and wrapping things up here on Hotcast at 1.5. Are you surprised by that? What do you, because last week it was 12.5 with Michigan State. Obviously, Cade was expected to play the entirety of the game there. I didn't believe that like I'm not a betting guy, but if I was a betting guy, hammer the under. Like I will take that under on that spread all day. But at 1.5, that's a close game all game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think that I feel like that should just be the line whenever Iowa plays, though. All those games I feel like are going to be
Yeah.
like they got to lean on a defensive touchdown or a special team touchdown, like from Cooper last week, to kind of give them some breathing room. But um, I was not going to go out and blow people out, as I'm sure you know, when you get into Big Ten play. Obviously, you're playing against Western Michigan and those teams, you can kind of impose your will on them. But I think I think if I had to guess, the odds makers are betting on Purdue to just continue this momentum that they've had. And then, like you mentioned, they're looking at McNamara out, Deacon Hill coming in, very little experience at the college level. So I think that plays a large part in it.
Okay. And one other thing before we get into final score predictions or anything like that, just looking at the amount of points that Purdue's offense has scored: 24 against Virginia Tech, 20 against Syracuse, 17 against Wisconsin, and then 44 against Illinois. Iowa's defense is definitely the toughest they've faced to this point in the season. What are realistic expectations scoring wise? Do you think they'll get up above 20?
I think if they can do that, it'll be a win
Right.
because I don't think Iowa's forced too many turnovers, but Purdue's been very susceptible to them, like I mentioned. So I mean, Purdue's got to take care of the ball, and if they can get the run game going, I think that they could have some success. It's going to be tough throwing against those DBs, like you mentioned earlier. Um, but I think someone we haven't talked about, I thought you were going to ask about, is Deion Burks. He's a guy that they've started to try to get him more involved in the offense in different areas. So he has a little like shovel pass that he caught and ran in for a score. I think that they could do some creative things to get the ball into his hands in space. And he's a guy that he can score a touchdown on any play. It doesn't matter where he's at. Ryan Walters called him a freak, and he was on the athletics freak list. He's a different animal. 5'11", blazing fast, fastest guy on the team according to Walters. So he's a guy that could break things out. But to go back to your original question, I think if they can get up to 20, I think it'll be a win. And it might be too much for Iowa to come back from if Purdue can get out to a 10-0, 14-0 lead early.
While we're at it, is there anybody else that I should have asked about?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay.
Max Clare, who was their top tight end, um, went down against Illinois. Uh, They haven't come out and said it yet, but I would be willing to bet that he probably is not going to suit up on Saturday.
Okay. So Deion Burks, that's a name to watch for the Iowa defense.
Mhm.
And does he kind of like flip around where he does things on the, is he like a utility? Is he an X? Is a Y? Is he a slot? Where is he at offensively for Purdue?
He can do a little bit of everything. They've lined him up in the backfield a couple times, but I don't know how comfortable he is back there. He broke out for 152 and 2 touchdowns in the season opener after having 149 all of last year as a redshirt freshman. So he's just explosive, and I think he's really honing in on his craft in terms of route running and tempo and things like that. He's talked openly about that. And then on top of that, he's just really hard to bring down, and he can catch basically any ball you throw in his vicinity, even though he's on the shorter side, he can catch it. I mean, the way he can move his, but it's unlike anything I've seen from Purdue receiver. Because like going back to Rondale Moore, like he was explosive and fast, but he didn't have the dexterity of Deion Burks. He couldn't. He wasn't that guy that can go up and make acrobatic grabs. So Deion
Skills?
Burks, yeah,
Yeah. Okay. I got you. Now, as we wrap things up, do you have a final score prediction?
I didn't coming into this, but I think Purdue rolls in there, and I think they get it done. I truly do. I think that surprised you.
Yeah, it did. Yeah.
Because I just even with Purdue's defensive struggles, I don't know if I will be able to keep up with them if the offense can get rolling like they have in the second half of the Wisconsin game and then all the Illinois game. And I think I was making a joke. I thought it might be a race to 14, 17, 20. So I think final score, gun to my head, I'm going to go 21-17 Boilers.
All right. Um, one stat that well, we kind of have to keep our eyes on every game for Iowa is the number of plays, like the difference between the two offenses. Obviously, it was horrendous against Penn State. I don't even remember what it was. It was like 70 something to like 30 something, if that. And then you look at last week and going into the fourth quarter, Michigan State had run 20 more plays than Iowa did at that point in time. So that's just always going to be a factor, because if you have this type of offense with this type of playmakers, with that type of quarterback, something's going to happen. Something's going to, Deion Burks could slip through a Xavier Wampa tackle and go for 60 yards, and that's that. So ultimately, I'd probably say, man, it's a tough one. I'd probably say 17, either 17-14 or 17-13 Iowa. Probably it's just kind of become a running thing of, oh, I got a special teams or a defensive touchdown in there, because that's what they have to do to win. It's so bad.
I think
Uh,
if sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just going to ask you what you thought. Go ahead.
Yeah, if they do that, then they're going to be in a really good spot. I think they have to, honestly, every single game. They're going to have to, and that's what I talked about a little earlier. Like Purdue can't turn the ball over against this team. You can't give an admittedly subpar offense extra opportunities, especially in the short field. I don't know how good their kicker is, but even if you're giving up field goals, I mean, every single possession in this game is going to be at a premium, and Purdue can't have any miscues.
Iowa's kicker is good. Drew Stevens is really good. He hit one from 52 with ease last week. And he said he was hitting from 60 pretty regularly in practice without trying to force it. So yeah, he's a pretty damn good kicker. He got put on scholarship this last year after kicking. I think he only missed 2 field goals all season as a true freshman, as a walk-on. So yeah, he's pretty damn good. And I think that one thing that you referenced toward the top of the show is that Purdue's offense has kind of moved. I don't know if with ease is the right phrase, but with ease between the 20s, and things get hard in the red zone. Well, that's kind of Iowa's defensive
Yeah.
MO, right? So, um, that's gonna definitely benefit Iowa there. And if they can force a turnover and just get something out of it, you force a turnover in Purdue territory and you get a field goal, that's a win for the Iowa offense. So gonna definitely be looking for that. Dub, anything else before we get out of here on this one? Are you going to be in Iowa City this weekend?
First time going out there, man. I'm excited.
It's fun. Kinnick has a nice press box, and best food I've ever had is like at a game is 100% in Iowa City.
I was gonna say because a bunch of us went to Virginia Tech, and it was that long delay. We were sitting up there for 6 hours, I think it was, and they didn't have any food for us. It was brutal. So let's hope we don't have a 6 hour delay in Iowa.
People have PTSD after the Nevada game last year. People were leaving at like 3 a.m. So we're hoping that doesn't happen too. Either way, folks in Iowa City do a good job of taking care of us media. So looking forward to meeting you there. We will wrap it up here, this episode of Hotcast. We appreciate you tuning in. Brought to you by Iowa.rivals.com. If you're not a premium subscriber yet, you can do that today at Iowa.rivals.com/subscribe. Ton of great recruiting info coming, especially on the basketball side of things. 4-star recruit Pharaoh Compton on his official visit last weekend. He sat down with me and we talked about it. That article is up on Iowa.rivals.com right now. So if you want to check that out, you can subscribe today. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a rate and review wherever you're listening. If you're on YouTube, hit that like button, drop a comment, let us know what you're thinking, your predictions for the game this weekend. So for now, I am Eliot Clough at Eliot Clough on Twitter. We'll see you next time.